Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Yaz Lime. I'm the trainee artist curator here at Eastside Projects. We also have Gavin Wade and Adham with us today. And I'm just going to do a short visual description of myself. I'm a light brown person with long brown hair, glasses, a green beret and some headphones. And behind me is a kind of busy office sort of environment. Just to say that this recording, it is being recorded, this video today, and we also have live captions for people that would like to use them. If you just go to the bottom of the page, it says live transcript and a CC and a grey button. And you're more than welcome to click on those and you'll get a live transcript. They're not 100%, but they are quite good. And we'll edit the text and upload it onto our website after this is done. So yeah, if we could just go to Gavin for a visual description and then Adam for a visual description, and then it'll come back to me and I'll do some introductions.
Hi, I'm Gavin. I'm artist curator here at Eastside Projects. I'm a white man with a perfectly bald head, black glasses, white t-shirt, and I'm in the corner of my office with a little pastoral landscape and lake jigsaw behind me on the wall by Ian Scoyles. Over to you, Adham.
Thanks. I'm Adham Faramawi. I'm an artist. I'm here to talk with Gavin and Yaz today. I'm a brown person in a grey hat and grey top, sat in my living room.
Great. So this is a studio visit, part of our series, talking to artists about their practice, about what they're doing at the moment. And so just a bit of intro for Adham. They're an artist whose work spans media, including moving image, sculptural installation and print. And they use technology to discuss issues of materiality, touch, and uses those ideas to kind of question ideas of the natural in relation to kind of marginalised identities. Their video works have been screened extensively across the UK as well as globally. And they were shortlisted for the Jarman Award in 2017, and they have been nominated again this year, which we're really excited about. And Adham is working with Eastside Projects for an exhibition which starts in September called Loop, September this year, co-curated by Howard Offe. And I wanted to start off asking you, Adham, about where you are at the moment and a bit about your studio practice. Yeah, we can start there.
Okay, yeah, so we're in my flat. Hi. I do keep a studio, which I share in Stratford, about a mile from where I live in Forest Gate. But I very purposefully don't have internet in my studio so that it's really like a dedicated production space. And I do all of my kind of internet and computer-based work at home. So I have like a dedicated space here and I have space there, and I keep them as separate as I can, basically, so that I can't touch social media when I'm making something.
Wow.
A lot of your work is like technology, so is it kind of a big technology setup?
No,
there, no.
And actually, it's funny. There are a lot of misnomers in that. I feel quite complicated about this use of technology, even though I wrote that statement. But honestly, like this use of technology thing, it was never the driving force. It's more a response. It's reactive rather than generative in a way. It's that, you know, digital media was, you know, at now and also at the time of my while I was studying, this kind of it still felt nascent at the time, but it was fast becoming the prevalent mode of communication. So for me to investigate it and to question it and to prod it and poke it felt like the thing, you know, that was how I wanted to operate. So I talked about technology, but it also was reactive in that while I was studying, I was very lucky in that, you know, I went to the Royal Academy and they are very proactive about, or they were once I was there, about, you know, getting press and being quite public, teaching how to talk to patrons and be very public facing in a lot of ways. But to be really honest, I wasn't comfortable with how they dealt with race. So I decentered many of the issues of identity that they problematically centered, and I made technology available to them as a discourse. You know, it made funding available to me, but actually it's not the thing that I'm really talking about in a way, I don't think.
Yeah.
It just so happens that the way that we mediate images happens digitally.
How would you, how, when you have studio visits in the flesh, then in real life, in person, do you let people come into the real studio and meet you there?
Yeah,
And
I mean, not in COVID, but not during COVID, but yes.
no.
I also do something, you know, as you two know, maybe some of the people watching this don't, a lot of, although I say, oh, I'm a sculptor, actually a lot of the work, it revolves around moving image. It's a lot of it's performance for camera. So I make sure to share videos beforehand and say, watch these, we won't be watching them together in the space. Like I'm not spending, you know, 20 minutes watching a video over your shoulder. So, you know, that's kind of how I operate. And then we are able to talk about things that are happening in the space. But to be really honest, the way that the studio visit functions for me can very happily, you know, operate outside of the production space.
Right. So I guess that there's something. I mean, there's even something in that in relation to the loop idea of how we invited you into the exhibition here, and I'll just give a little bit of a sense of how that's developed for everyone else as well. So we were working with Harold Offeh on the Sonia Boyce exhibition last year, and Harold made a few performances and workshops within the gallery also, and we were really thinking about how do we as an organization develop ourselves in relation to performance, and how do galleries respond to them, how do they adapt, how do they evolve in a way, you know, do they need to be different types of galleries in the future where sculpture is perhaps becomes a predominantly performative process. So just sort of open questions, and we thought that Harold was dealing with some of those ideas and concerns and problematics, and we invited Harold to start working with the team here and talking about how we could curate a show together and who we would like to invite. And I think there's even something within you talking about yourself as a sculptor and seeing the video works and being being challenged about the rules of what happens on the screen and how we're meant to respond to it, and things coming forward and breaking through, and it always has that working outside of what is expected in a way, and who is speaking and which body is where and in relation to who else. And these are all things that I suppose really we're all really fascinated by, and I suppose in the studio visit we just want to find out more about those things in a way to begin to understand them more, to connect with them in a deep way. And in a way that's what I think the Loop exhibition is. It's an invitation to think about looping processes, the problematics of live experiences at the moment, and these ideas were you know ventured before the pandemic, but the pandemic brought them even more into focus. So I just think it'd be interesting to hear you say about how your first thoughts and how you've developed the beginnings of the work for Loop, because I know that it's not resolved yet, it's not completed, it's still in progress. So it'd be good to talk about that work, which is also available to watch on our stream now, on the Eastside Projects stream. We've just made that available. It was live on June the 11th, but if you didn't get to see it, you can watch more of it later. But Adham, how do you approach talking about that process?
It's interesting. I think that it's like what you're describing is a really self-conscious viewing mechanism.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I'm watching something, but I'm so aware of myself and myself in relation to other bodies and other things and the ways that our relationships are mediated. And that's so much at the center of what I've been doing, I think. And I often talk about the video work as being performance for camera in the mold of, say, Charles Atlas and Mess Cunningham, thinking very much about the difference between performing live, performing on a stage, performing in a space, and performing to a device that mediates your image, and how movement needs to be adapted for that. And often the choreography, which is always collaborative. You know, I'm very rarely credited as choreographer in videos. It's always that credit goes to the dancers, to the performers. I instigate. I provide like a context, and then we have a discussion as we find the movements in response to sound and space. But that's really the crux of it. Is setting up this very this point of real self-awareness of who do I have to be to receive this image? What does it assume of me?
Yeah. And how does the title, "We Danced with Each Other and with Plants," how does that extend that then? Is that, because I mean, I've just watched parts of the newer film as well.
I mean, the work in progress for the Loop TV was edited from some footage that I took of a day of workshopping with two dancers, Tyler Dean and Joseph Funnell. Joseph I've worked with a lot, so you'll notice them in you know, almost everything from the last 2 years. And we were figuring out movement in response to a piece of classical, mid-20th century classical music, French music, on the Wanstead Flats for a video called The Air is Subtle, Various and Sweet, which I finished a version of for the Serpentine Gallery. There was an event in December, which was online, and which is actually, I think, the video that's going to be shown as part of the Jarman touring. But that video was a departure in some ways. It was something that I did at the height of that I developed at the height of the COVID, of the first lockdown, and it was, you know, it was a difficult moment. It was a difficult moment for everyone. Things were tense. BLM was happening. I was in a very public, sort of a very racialized fight for the university teaching job that I'm in, and that got a lot of press, and it felt very intense. But I also, my father passed away, and I wasn't able to go to Egypt for his wake or for his funeral, which happened actually, you know, there was a version of his wake that happened on YouTube, so I had to sit there and stream it after a race meeting with New Contemporaries, and the whole thing was just very difficult. So I needed, you know, I gave myself some space to process that, thinking about our varying relationships to place. My dad was an interesting character. He was an artist, a political cartoonist, a musician. He wrote and performed in plays. He had a TV show for a bit, but he really centered his heritage and his working class Falahi roots. So Falah in Egyptian, in Arabic, it's a working class agricultural group, and so, you know, where he centered that, even though he was working in a very cosmopolitan, metropolitan, urban context as a, you know, as a nationally syndicated political cartoonist, you know, and on national television, he always said, look, these are my roots. This is where I come from. This is my family. Him ending up in the UK and leaving me here is kind of a miracle in itself. You know, just getting a visa to come to London is not a straightforward thing for an Egyptian. So for me to be in East London and figuring out my complicated relationship to place, especially at a time during lockdown where really the only thing I had to do was, thankfully I live very close to a nature reserve that leads into Epping Forest. It's called the Wanstead Flats. And so I was able to make some work there and just figure out, well, what is it to be in, you know, at the edge of a city, you know.
Yeah. And it feels that you were able, it's a very powerful, very moving work. I think it feels like you are, as the artist, are dealing with all of that life change and process and passing on. And so I think it's quite an amazing work. But I presume that was a way to connect, because you couldn't physically even go to.
Well, I mean, connection is a really important word, actually, because, you know, those were the questions that I was asking of the dancers. I was saying, you know, at a time where we, at a point, say a year and a half ago, I was very, very involved in working with contact improv. So, you know, that's a form of dance where the performers are always have at least one point of contact. There's always an issue of touch and what it to mediate touch. What happens when that's no longer available to you? How do you make connection? You know, and so we talked about synchronicity, syncopation, how you find each other in synchronized movement, how you find connection with each other for the camera, to communicate connection with each other for a third party, for a viewer. How do you do that? And that was really a lot of what the workshop was about, because we hadn't done that before. We didn't have answers for that.
That was, you're saying that these are dancers that you knew before, and so I'm guessing that maybe trust and the knowledge of each other's bodies and each other's boundaries and needs and abilities came into that as well. I guess, do you think it's important for you to keep the same dancers to continue to build that dialogue and connection?
It has been, and also actually you bring up an important point for me in my approach. I have often instigated some very sensitive behaviors, and, you know, even relying on particular identity forms with the dancers. We have those conversations, and it's important. Full transparency is there, that they know what the work will be communicating, what the thematic issues that I'm bringing up and drawing together, what the stories I'm telling, how are their bodies really being employed in that narrative. So I'm very, very open with that, and it does really help me when I have a personal relationship, generally speaking, but also that I trust them as well as them trusting me, you know, because I'm giving something really personal.
Yeah. And the dances are very, very intimate, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Even if you're not touching, it's what you're broadcasting out is intimate.
Well, that's kind of what I meant by identity form, you know, like what I mean is that, you know, these are performers from a variety of gender presentations, you know, performing in ways that imply certain kinds of connection. Some of those are romantic, to do with desire, to do with, you know, multiple forms of relation to each other, which are denied in many places. Like these works can't be shown in every territory on the planet because of what they imply. These are sensitive behaviors, actually. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, thank you for asking that. That's a really important question. Yeah.
Cool. Oh, you're on
Sorry.
mute.
I guess I wanted to ask as well about how you've started these workshops and you call it like a video sketch. So I'm guessing I'm assuming that when I read sketch, it's almost this experimental kind of doodle and first sort of try. And I guess I wondered how you're going to develop that for Loop, knowing that, or hopefully that this is a space you can explore those sort of more sensitive issues, exploring gender, exploring sexuality, and how you think that you're going to move forward or think more about the issues that came up with those workshops.
So the videos that I made that sketch out of, it was sort of it felt a bit like opening up a sketchbook and showing a bunch of people some stuff, but I had to make the sketch after the fact, because I would never have needed to edit that video together unless I was trying to communicate the process of making for Loop, for Loop TV. I had done that and I got what I needed from it to make the Aristotle, Various and Sweet. And I've developed, it's kind of developing into a series of works where I've literally in the last couple of days finished a work for Art Night, which is going live tomorrow, called The Heart Wants What the Heart Wants, which kind of sits in an oddly more science fictive place and centers issues of gender presentation much more in a much more focused way, I think. So in a way it sort of sits as a link piece between Skin Flick, which is a work that I made in 2019, and this, you know, this work in the Wanstead Flats. So I think, or I plan for this new work that will go into Loop to be a shorter and more succinct, but dealing with, you know, it will be more succinct work, but it will be dealing with similar issues thematically about place, roots, heritage. How did we get here, and how do we relate to each other now that we are?
Yeah. Is that in across the sort of broader parts of the work? Are they the thematics that feed into some of this? I suppose now I would say like this very sculptural approach to bodies within liquids and in liquid states, and the movement of features and bones and skin, and that's something that I think when I'm watching it, I feel a bit shocked sometimes by what happens within it, because I could feel my whole body responding to the actions, because you sort of feel them as much as just see them and hear them. It's like you feel that space. But I'm interested in that fluidity that runs through it. And I know that in some of the works there is an element of almost manifesto about some actions, which, so you might say that, you know, gender fluidity is there within it, and it's mentioned, and you talk about what that means. But is that literalized into the fluid, the pouring, in the newer film, when you sort of mentioned smearing aloe vera juice onto your body and allowing that to heal you, and I thought, wow,
on creams on yourself and on each other.
yeah.
Right. So I feel like I have to go back a couple of years to the time when I was graduating, which is like 2012, 2013. And at the time I was thinking about complicity, you know. I was watching a lot of TV for the first time in years, and I'd noticed that water was like a trend at the time. Like, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but do you remember, like, everybody was drinking bottled water a lot at the time? And it was like there were a lot of adverts for bottled water. And there was this shift in TV advertising where most of the liquids that were being used to advertise these brands of bottled water, like Smart Water, were CGI liquids. And I was just like, well, what does this mean? And the bodies that are being used to associate qualities with this water, you know, what is that? How are my desires being used to make me behave in certain ways? What is my complicity? So, you know, these were the issues that attracted me to this, to liquidity. Like, how am I being compelled to behave in particular ways via the use of images? So I started making works which reproduce some of those strategies, try to intensify some of those strategies, those commercial strategies, but push them to a point of collapse, push them to a point of break. And a really close friend of mine, a painter called Celia Hempton, who we exhibited quite a lot together at that time, she recommended that I read Being in Nothingness, but not all of Being in Nothingness, the Sartre book from the 50s. She said there's a very short segment in the back about liquidity, solidity, and slime. And so I've talked about this quite extensively, this issue of going back to that text over and over, because it's a really problematic 2 paragraphs where Sartre describes slime as a transfeminine substance. And he says, slime is the agony of water, which is a gorgeous sentence, but it's also so compellingly wrong and gross, you know? Like, he really states, like, solidity as a masculine quality, liquidity as a feminine quality, slime is something abjectly in between these things, these 2 binary states. And it's been written about quite a lot. I don't really need to go on over it, but it in an odd way sort of provided me a point of resistance. It allowed me to co-opt that idea as a way to resist certain.
I think as well with the like women's bodies, especially in like religious circles, I guess this idea of like uncleanliness and, like, for example, menstruation and being dirty and cleaning yourself and washing and all of that, it kind of feeds into this. So you use the word gross, like, yeah, this kind of being gross, being unclean. So I don't know, that's just what it kind of made me
Oh,
think
true.
of.
I mean, absolutely. Like this issue of like ablution. I was raised as Muslim. I am Muslim, and yeah, like you know, people who have periods can't pray during their days. You know, which is strange. But it also it, so I'm a really big fan of the poet Nisha Ramaya, and in her book States of the Body Produced by Love, there's this amazing section on Matangi, the goddess. I think she's the ninth of the Mahavidyas. I think that's correct. I'm not good. I'm not Hindu, but she was a figure that is so compelling for me, because she's like this wild, sweaty jungle goddess with green skin, and she is the goddess of the lower castes, and I found this particularly helpful, this idea that her offerings are leftover food offered with unwashed hands, and blood-stained clothes that, you know, stained by menstrual blood. And I just thought, what an incredibly liberating and amazing way to disentangle yourself from this idea of the feminine as unhygienic, you know?
Yeah.
Like
And
this,
it also fits in with the idea of what you're saying about advertising. I mean, there was a lot of kind of controversy about when you're advertising menstrual products, you use blue liquid as opposed to like actual blood or something that resembles blood. It's like this weird blue liquid. Um,
I
yeah, I
can't
don't know why that is.
excitedly, exactly. That's exactly it. It's this uncanny sublimation of the body. It's like, what was wrong with, you know, why? Why?
So does that connect to this sense of being on the edge of things as well? That idea of, I was sort of interested at the start of the film about your father. You sort of reiterate at the edge of the city, and that idea of being not in the center, being the peripheral, and often elements are happening around the edges of screens as well. Is that a further continuation or resistance of, in some way? Or
I mean, I think when I said that sentence, I wanted to give a texture of London and how it's operating now for me as a person of color, but also as a, you know, as a self-employed person who has been, you know, all of us, this isn't just a thing about artists.
yeah,
London has been hollowed out, you know? So I've been, I lived 10 years ago, I lived in zone 1. Now I live in zone 3. And this is, you know, a design from the top. And I just wanted to introduce that as a texture, as a sense of feeling at the edge of this urban space. And that there's a point here of, although, say, Forest Gate is not thought of as like a romantic place, the words Forest Gate, gate to the forest, there's a real poetry in that. There's something really beautiful, I think, in that.
yeah.
It has a history. It had, like, these places have a history, and I'm a history nerd. I want to know what happened here. How does that affect how I move through this place?
Yeah. And how does that fact that you, I suppose that people are really interested in the things that you're finding and pointing out and showing, just because of, you know, you've got a lot of projects happening at the moment. You're really busy. You've got the art night project. I mean, it just feels like you're finishing off lots of works and working through and in demand. And how is that affecting your practice at the moment, the studio practice? And
All right. I have something to say about this, actually. Okay. All right. Yes, I have been working 7 days a week for the last 4 or 5 months. And I mean that very literally. I had 1 day off 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
It wasn't a good idea. I did it. Here we are. But I actually think this is more like a COVID mirage.
Oh.
In a way, because a lot of stuff was either you know, postponed or cancelled last year, and it's just come back. Everybody wants things now because it's the financial new year. Everybody has to get everything out of the way so they can get more money for next year. And this is the reason that everything is happening in June all of a sudden, I think, you know, because they have a backlog of content. This is work I made months ago, like the
Yeah.
Queer Circle conversations are something that was supposed to happen last March. I was working on that in January.
Okay.
You know, Art Night is supposed to happen this time last year in 2020. So, you know, it's not real.
Yeah.
I am busy. It is hurting. It's not fun for me to be working 7 days a week. That is partly because of COVID and because people's expectations, as much as care and being compassionate and empathetic has become like an art world trope. It's not real.
Yeah.
The realities are that we work for very little money 7 days a week. But this idea that I'm doing something every day, no, I did this last summer.
Yeah. Yeah. So it makes me want to say extra thanks for doing this today, actually, because that makes me, because I know that it's been an intense period. Yeah, and it does all, you know, reflects back on organisations, and we have to ask questions about ourselves, what we ask of people all the time, I think, as well, because it is we get ourselves caught up in it all as well without realising. So I think it's very important point that, you know, for you to say that as well, and for us to be sharing that. Yeah, thanks.
Out and open.
Cool.
I guess I wanted to ask a bit more about the work, and you've mentioned some things. You mentioned Egypt, you mentioned heritage, place, roots. You mentioned the word, like these kind of exoticized words like mirage. I just wondered, do you find that you're kind of drawing from certain cultures more, or certain
Should I have used the word
ideas?
hallucination?
I don't know. You mentioned mirage, and I was like, oh, that's a really quite, don't know how to describe it, as spicy word, I think.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, that's fine. Just, I guess, do you find that you're drawing from certain cultures, like Egyptian culture, for example, or modern dance cultures or traditional dance cultures? Like what sort of references, I guess, are you sort of drawing from? I'm curating a show at Eastside Projects in November, and I'm thinking about heritage craft specifically, but like artists that use sort of in the fine arts, modern fine arts, but using kind of traditional techniques and imagery. So I was just wondering, yeah, what sort of things you draw from, really.
Okay, that's a complicated question in that I really enjoy this idea of one of the roles of the artist being telling the story of your people. But as a member of multiple diasporic communities, I'm not sure if you've noticed, I don't deal well with definition or certainty, and I don't have a lot of stability to rely on. So I feel like I answer that question with a question, you know, it's like, what is that? What is the community? What, you know, who is we? Who is the we in the room? That's how this work feels. It feels like investigative and exploratory and probing, because I don't know, you know, like my personal heritage is that I was born in a hospital in Dubai before the boom to two Egyptian parents who were there to work in newspapers. My dad wanted to live in London, so he got a job with an Arabic newspaper here, and my mum got a job with the same newspaper after. And so we moved here and moved around. And then after my parents split up, I moved, my mum and my sister and me moved to a town on the East Coast, a very, very impoverished town called Great Yarmouth, which is one of those towns which is like working class, but also extremely conservative. Like that's where they go for like conservative vox pops. Really scares me. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where I'm coming from. And then, you know, thinking about queerness, gender orientation, sexual orientation, and how so many of the identity qualifiers that we use sit in ways that negate each other in me. you know, and just exist with each other as a short circuit.
Yeah.
Would you say that sometimes your work is talking about the absences or the gaps and the things that you don't know, maybe?
Hope so. Yeah, hope so. I think being messy in public is kind of important in a lot of ways. There aren't answers for all of these questions. The fact that I could find the question it took me a really long time. You know, I feel like it's important to sit. What is it? Sit with the trouble. Sit with that mess. See what it is. Find ways to name it.
Yeah, there's a phrase you question and sort of analyze and pull apart about being naturalized, and you say that so if you have become naturalized, does that mean you were unnaturalized before that point? Which is such a completely wrong metaphor and idea to have to accept. And of course, it's just there. It sits there as a possibility. It sort of made me think, as you were talking about the craft idea, whether traditional crafts are almost pitched as being natural in a way, like that is a natural state, and it's like something that's
somehow more authentic.
Yeah, has an authenticity. Yeah, which is actually like a branded advertising authenticity in a way, as much as a history of actually making. Sometimes
The Yaz question. What do you think, Yaz?
I think with my craft, I'm looking at straw working and straw weaving, and it's an endangered craft in the UK at the moment. So it's something that just isn't being passed on as a craft. And for me, it's like, I guess it's authentic in a way because it's making useful objects of ritual and agricultural use. And I think sometimes we have this kind of rural, or this idea of like the rural imagination, sort of looking at more rural places and thinking, oh yeah, there's something more authentic about that than the city that's man-made or that's built up. And I think maybe it has a connection there, something, with making with a city or making with materials that are metal and plastic, rather than making with materials that are found in the ground, that are natural.
I mean, I really respond to that. I relate to what you're saying, but it's I guess the traditions that I draw on are much more late 20th century onwards. You know, like television. I get, like some of the reasons that I make video. I mean, one of the first things that I learned to do is use a VHS player. My parents used to leave me as a 1-year-old with a VHS tape of Iftah Simsim, which is the Arabic version of Sesame Street. I would play it, then turn it off, take it out, turn it off, and go to my crib like that. Like that's my world. It's moving image. So this idea of like authenticity and craft and the hand and touch, it's all again up for question with me. Like I don't feel.
Yeah.
My dad,
even then,
was very much into this idea of like what's authentically Egyptian and making work out of clay,
But even then, you just described a lot of different touch responses of going to the VHS and having something physical and putting it into the VHS.
Videos is not thought of as a traditionally Arab cultural form. So, or like Fawzia Nilli, which is like she is around now, but she was a very popular singer and dancer and entertainer who did skits every night, different riddles on a TV show for Ramadan in the 80s. Like those kinds of performance for camera are what got me interested. That's what got me involved. That's what got me interested. I didn't dive straight into Western high modernism, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think we should watch something. I think it'd be nice to show a couple of.
Should we watch? What do we want to see? Should we?
We've mentioned Skin Flick a couple of times. It might be nice to see some of that, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think it'd be nice to show part of either we dance with each other and with plants, or I forget the name of the other film about the sweet air.
About the what? Sorry.
Is it sweet air? Sweet?
Oh, okay. All right, I'm just going to share my screen.
Because I wanted to ask you something about a little detail in one of those.
Well, I'll show the Aristotle.
And sweet.
I'll just show the first bit. Let me just.
I live at the edge of the city, near the forest. This nature reserve is the gate to the forest, at the edge of the city. I live at the edge of the city, near a nature reserve that leads to the forest. This was marshland once. Medieval monks grazed their sheep here. Then it became a less favoured royal forest. The corporation that is the city bought the land and drained it. After legal battles fought by local groups against owners of nearby farmland, the corporation protected the forest. Victorian families paraded here listening to music played live on the bandstand. During World War II, American soldiers shot Luftwaffe bombers from balloons tethered to the ground here, protecting the city's industrial heartland just a few miles west. It was an assembly point prior to the D-Day invasion of 1944. Italian and German prisoners of war were housed here just a few meters from this spot. Locally, this place is called the Flats. Parts of it are protected. Every summer, ground nesting birds hatch eggs here and raise chicks. This summer, there's been a plague of sorts. A mortuary was set up here in response to the pandemic, but I didn't know that then. I just came here to walk, feel the sun on my skin, to listen, take my mask off and breathe. I've been numb for some time, except when I'm with plants, watching them, handling, walking through them. I think of their names, their roots and mine. Heritage. What is it to exist, to stand here now, together in this place? I can always see the city in my peripheral vision. I can hear its cars on the wind just under the birdsong. Once, this place was called the Lower Forest. Once it was called the Waste. Scotch broom, known as English broom in Australia, was introduced to colonies like America from the British Isles and Central Europe to serve as an ornamental plant and for erosion control.
Yes, great. It's great to
Scotch broom is used to treat blood disorders like heart problems, poor circulation, heavy mental.
The sound is still playing, isn't it?
Stopped. Have I stopped sharing my screen as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Digital artist works with technology.
I wanted to ask about the little hand movements when they put the hands behind their back and do this, because it's so it's so sort of like a amazing little detail. Was there a
That was Tyler's. Tyler started doing it and I just said, please, can we hold on to that? Because it's such a mannerist flourish. There's this really mannered, decorative moment of of a flutter.
yeah.
And there's something about the ways that I've been using music which gives it sort of provides this texture of European formalism. You know, So I think it's tied up in that, but it's also a camp. It's a camp humorous flourish, I guess. For me.
Yeah, I'd be interested. Maybe just show a bit of Skinflick as a contrast to that work, because there is quite a contrast between. And apart from the section at the end where the layering happens, and then it visually it connects back to some of the other films really strongly. So it's a very interesting contrast, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, thematically, to be honest, it's very much in the same realm, but it's visually, it's much more. I'm an experimental filmmaker ultimately, but it's a much more science fictive work, which, if you get a chance to watch the Art Night piece tomorrow, which will be up, from 8 p.m. tomorrow and over the weekend.
Cool.
You'll see real direct links, you know, like the monstrous narrator comes back, and you know, it's the whole thing. Anyway, which bit of it should I show? Like the dance bit at the end, or what?
Maybe, yeah, because I think it's good to show, as it intensifies, people can imagine it starts off
Okay,
simpler.
Sharing screen.
The sex life of plants is a complex affair. Plants and animals, even understood as other than people, are ubiquitously queer. Not naturally so, but plants insinuate forms of polymorphous perversity unimaginable to human bodies. Under scrutiny, our own sexualities become illegible, unfamiliar. I look up at my arms, my hands, and find them replaced by screens showing Cindy Crawford drinking Pepsi. I think about toxins. When I decompose, I want the earth around me fruitful. I want to be a tree like Daphne, transforming from a patch test on my skin, growing through the worms, the mushrooms and the bacteria. I want to become an apple tree in an orchard of apple trees.
That's an amazing line in a film, that is. You want to become the apple tree.
The apple tree. I'm pretty fond of Cindy Crawford, to be honest.
Yeah, that's very good as well. It's fantastic. That's really great to watch them after all the conversation going through. It's just, I sort of feel this, yeah, there's so much of that, of the conversation of the work within the work. It's there, you kind of provide it. It's very generous in that way. So I think it's great. It's still great to be able to talk around it as well. I think I really enjoyed that. I think we should just in case put out if there's any other questions of anyone listening, watching with us here. If anyone wants to ask any questions, you can put your hand up or you can write it in the chat. We've been asking quite a lot of Adham already, but nice to get in with a few extras if you want. Anyone would like to ask anything? I can't actually see any hands.
Yeah, Rachel.
May as well ask something in spirit of joining in.
Sure.
Hey, thanks so much. I was thinking when you were playing sequence which talks about birds, that the dance is quite bird-like, and then that made me start to think about sound and sound recording and how you compose the soundtracks, because I don't think you talk about that so much as you do about the image, and I wondered if there's anything you wanted to share there.
I collaborate on the sound on the most part. I've worked with a bunch of different producers, mostly electronic producers, and I am someone who, when I collaborate, I ask people because of what they do already, and I provide a context. I instigate something, and then I let it happen. And when it shifts outside of the remit of the work, then I'm like, hey, what do you think about that bit? And just ask questions. That's probably why I don't talk so much about the choreography and the sound to the same level of focus that I do about, say, the camera work or the edit. But my approach to sound is quite loose in a lot of ways. I use a lot of Foley, and I use a lot of found diegetic sound to produce space. It's an issue of producing a physical space, so that the birds, some of them were there, some of them actually weren't there, and it's just stuff I added. I recorded those the crows. There are a lot of crows and ravens on the Wanstead Flat, so I have some some field recordings of that I added.
Do you say it fits into the, you use the word texture quite a lot? It's like another texture.
Yeah. I'm one of these people that I'm uncomfortable talking about feelings and emotions when I'm sort of doing an academic art talk, but truthfully, it's about producing emotions.
Yeah.
That's how I sort of deal with sound. It's like intuition, and
yeah,
it takes me a while to figure out why I think something is working. It's something that I do with my students. I'm like, it's fine to work intuitively as long as you are rigorous with yourself after the fact to ask yourself, well, actually, why did you enjoy this? Why did it work?
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's like for me, it's really emotive. I feel really uncomfortable saying that to Rachel Pym, whose research I'm a huge fan of.
I think we're fanning on each other. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that sense of how it's hard to describe in another language what you've made or struggled really hard to do in the form of the artwork, isn't it? Often it's like it can be a trap that you should also try and explain it in just by talking about it, and can achieve the same thing that you can achieve through all of those layers that you're making in the work. And yet we often do ask of it people to do that, particularly in the art world.
I want to do a tiny plug, because me and Rachel just did, like, for transparency, we just did like a, you know, I mentioned the Queer Circle Conversations, which was like an online residency that took the form of a series of conversations. One of them happened with Rachel, and this is someone who's been incredibly generous with me. So go on the queercircle.org website and read the conversation I had with Rachel, because that is someone who has a lot to say.
Cool.
Put your hands to your face, but it's too late now.
I've shared that in the chat.
Thanks, Jess.
Does anyone else have any last questions?
We are coming to it is 2 o'clock now, so
we've gone on way too long.
yeah.
too many interesting things. Okay, so I think we can wrap up, because that's been really fantastic, Adham. Thank you very much for that. It's been really, really great. I mean, it always leaves us wanting more, but that's just a sign of a great artist. Thank you very much.
Nice of you to say. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for sitting through the chat. It was really nice to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
I just want to mention the Loop exhibition will be, I think it's the 24th of September that it will open. So please do come along, and that will again coincide with our partners and co-commissioners at the Dance Exchange and Birmingham International Dance Festival. So please do come along and experience however that is going to manifest. We are in the process of finding out. Thank you very much, everybody.
And just a last thing to say, this recording will be on our event page, Adham's event page, soon with the whole transcript as well. And hopefully you can join us next time for our next online toolkit is with Candice, who's the other trainee artist curator, and it's going to be on poetry and music. And if you go on our website and our event page, you'll see all of the other events that we've got going on. But yes, we hope to see you in September for Loop. And yeah, thank you everyone again.